paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
Entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Everybody, my name is Nick Bryant, and welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. I've left my virtual digs at the Overlook Hotel, and here I am overlooking beautiful New York City. I actually live in New York City, but my view isn't quite like this. I stare out at a brick wall. Today's podcast is going to be a PowerPoint on the Franklin scandal. And I'm going to walk people through the Franklin scandal. I've noticed through the comments that a number of people haven't read the Franklin scandal, and this will be kind of a Cliff Notes version of the Franklin scandal. And then I'll show you some where one of the perpetrators is today, and he's still trying to infiltrate groups that will give him access to children. Here's a copy of my book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And this is Lawrence E. King, who was the manager of the Franklin Credit Union, which is where the Franklin Scandal gets its name from. Here is Lawrence E. King singing the national anthem at the 1984 Republican Convention. He's a very evil man, but he had a very good voice. And here's Lawrence E. King living large. There was a Omaha newspaper. King is centered in Omaha, by the way. There was an Omaha newspaper that ran a profile of Larry. And this is what Larry has to say. Little name dropping. In fact, Larry and Kay and the rest of the gang were down in New Orleans at the Republican convention. King, in fact, did a little more than attend. He threw a little reception honoring Reagan administration minority appointments. The host committee included Gerald Ford, Senators John McCain and Jack Kemp, Drew Harris, and Al Haig, to name a few. So we see that Larry is running in circles that are near Mount Olympus. But while Larry is being a Republican power broker, there's some troubles on the horizon for him. King's cousin, Barbara Webb, adopted a number of children, and she and her husband were very, very vicious to these kids. They had 8 kids in this house. And here is a report from social services. In 3 separate incidents, 5 children have ran away from the Webb home. Those children are Wally and Kevin, June of 1985, Tracy and Robert, August of 1985, and Lisa, November of 1985. Repeated allegations of physical abuse told to our department by 6 children during separate interviews, of being struck for long periods of time while naked by various objects, including a belt, a rubber hose, and the railroad prop, denial of meals in the home, and sexual abuse of Lisa by Jared, her stepfather, which was supported by a polygraph. No one in social services acted on this information, although Lisa or Ulysses was supported by a polygraph. And Ulysses went to another foster home, and she got to know her foster mother very well. And she told her foster mother that she had been that she'd been transported and flown, and she was part of a pedophile network that was run by Lawrence E. King. So her foster mother knew a youth worker at Boys Town, because Ulysses said that a number of the kids on the flight were from Boys Town. And Julie Walters, the youth worker, penned a 46-page report on the abuse, and she named a number of Boys Town kids in her report. And this is the first documented FBI intervention. As we'll see, the FBI will do everything in its power to cover this network up. But there was a social worker named Joni Gregory. She felt that like something was wrong with the Webb household. The kids would appear as perfect mannequins when she visited, but she sensed that something was wrong. And she started to look into the Webb household. And at a certain point, she was warned by the FBI. The FBI informed Joni Gregory that it would probably be in her best interest if she forgot about this information. So that's the first documented FBI intervention that we have. There might have been more earlier FBI interventions, but this is the first documented FBI in February of 1990. The Omaha Police Department ultimately launched a child pornography investigation into King, and this is the first report, and a number of reports were generated, but this is the first report on May 5th of 1988. And this is another report on the Omaha Police Department's investigation into Lawrence King for child pornography. King had various apartments around Omaha where he stashed his victims, and the police interviewed one of the women who owned one of the apartments. Her name was Karen Beveridge, and she stated that she had also heard that Larry King is a homosexual and has a preference for young men or boys. So that's the second report that was generated in this investigation. And then there was a third report generated in this investigation. The girl's name was Shanetta Moore, and she was at this point in a psychiatric hospital. And according to Shanetta, she had gotten mixed up in child pornography and attending these pedophilic parties when she was about 10 years old. And the reporting officer had previously interviewed Moore concerning incidents of child pornography and devil worship. During the interview, she stated that Larry King was involved in these incidents. So as the Omaha Police Department started to investigate this, then suddenly they generated reports, but then all of a sudden their investigation just stopped. There was no more reports generated. And here's an Omaha Police Department inter-office memo. During the period of the investigation, there were rumors being circulated that Chief Wadman, the chief of the Omaha Police Department, was quote unquote friends with Larry King, and that Chief Wadman had stayed at Larry King's home while in Washington, D.C. So it appears that Lawrence E. King and the Omaha Police Chief, Robert Wadman, have a friendship. Here is another inter-office memo, and this was written by Chief Wadman. And one of the police officers, Earl Carmine, who had generated the reports, he felt that there was a lot of leads that could have been followed, and he was very disappointed that they had basically been stopped from investigating Lawrence King. And this is what Chief Wadman has to say about Earl Carmine. This negative information seemed to fall into two areas. Number one, that the Omaha Police Division was aware of these sexual improprieties by Mr. King and did not investigate them. And number two, that due to Mr. King's influence and association with myself, the police chief, I intentionally hindered the investigation of Larry King. Well, this drama is playing out at the Omaha Police Department. The Foster Care Review Board is a part of the Omaha Child Support Services, and it reviews foster care placements. Ultimately, what happened was the report that was written by the Boys Town social worker, Julie Walters, reached the foster care board, along with some other accounts of victims. And Carol Stitt, who was head of the Foster Care Review Board, wrote a letter to the Attorney General of Nebraska. Pursuant to the Nebraska child abuse statutes, the State Foster Care Review Board is making a report of allegations of a child exploitation ring and respectfully requests an investigation. But there was no investigation. The Omaha Police Department had pulled back on investigating, and then the Omaha Attorney General just basically ignored the Foster Care Review Board's complaint about a child abuse exploitation ring. And then at a certain point, Lawrence E. King gets audited. He hadn't been audited in 4 years, although federally insured credit unions have to be audited yearly. Larry finally got audited, and the Franklin Credit Union came up $39.5 million short. And the Nebraska Senate formed the Franklin Committee to investigate King and the credit union because they realized that credit unions were audited yearly, and they were very perplexed that Lawrence E. King was able to embezzle nearly $40 million out of the credit union. And then all of a sudden, the tales of the allegations of child abuse started drifting up because the people in social services, the Foster Care Review Board, was starting to talk to the senators. And here is a headline from the New York Times: "A lurid, mysterious scandal begins taking shape in Omaha." And then the Lincoln Journal quoted the Attorney General Spire and Police Chief Wadman, and they said they denied lack of action on child abuse case. And here are quotes. Nebraska Attorney General Robert Spire said, "We did receive some sensitive information in July. My office acted promptly and professionally, and nothing was sat on." So Attorney General Robert Spire is lying because his office did nothing once they received that information from the Foster Care Review Board. And here's a quote from Omaha Police Department Chief Robert Wadman: "Every step that should have been taken was taken." Robert Wadman seems to have forgotten that they had generated a number of child pornography reports on Lawrence E. King and then just had suddenly stopped. And actually, only one victim was interviewed, but they knew of additional victims. So the Nebraska Senate, after they formed the Franklin Committee, they hired Gary Caradori. He was an amazing investigator. He had been with the Nebraska State Patrol, and he had launched his own private investigative firm, which numbered about 200 people. And Gary Caradori, he was one of the most prominent private investigators in the Midwest. And Gary Caradori went to work pretty quickly, and he compiles over 200 flight receipts of Lawrence E. King. And it's interesting, most of these flight receipts, I have like 200 of them. They either say Mr. King +4, or Mr. King +5, or Mr. King +6. No one is ever named other than Larry King. And what's really interesting is the vast majority of the flights go to Washington, D.C. and back from Washington, D.C. This is a Caradori investigative report. He's talking with a woman who was employed by a company that chartered planes. In reference to her prior employment at Sky Harbor Air Service, Miss Littlejohn stated that she was employed sometime, she thought, around 1985, 1986. She was employed there for several months. She stated that she would see Larry King fly out of Sky Harbor on average of at least once a week, and that every time he would depart, there would be young adult males on those flights. She stated that these young males were very good looking, attired in fancy suits, gold chains, watches, and rings, and they were very clean cut and clean shaven. She stated that it was very odd to her none of these young adults would talk. So Larry had instilled a omerta in the victims that he was transporting around the country to be used by power broker pedophiles. And Caradori also found new victims. He found Alicia Owen, Troy Bonner, Danny King, and Paul Benassi, and he recorded over 20 hours of victim testimony. And other victims had come forward, and these four corroborated aspects of their story. Ulysses Washington had come forward, and Shonda Moore had come forward. And although these four didn't corroborate all their story, they corroborated parts of their story. And they all said that Lawrence E. King was the ringleader of the pedophile network. And then Caradori ultimately put together a leads list. It's 37 pages. It's got 271 names, and it's got it named 60 victims. And this was my big break when I was, or one of my big breaks when I was investigating the Franklin trafficking network, because I was able to find victims. I had a list of 60 victims, and I was able to find them. And a number of them were very difficult to find, because with this network, once you reached a certain age, if you performed well, you would get drugs and money. That was the carrot. But at a certain age, you were basically expunged, and you've got a very damaged young person in their late teens, early 20s, and they've generally come from dysfunctional, impoverished backgrounds, and they go on to commit crimes to support their drug addiction. And I saw this with a number of the victims that the Lawrence E. King victims that I found. I found them in projects. I found one in a homeless shelter. I found one in a prison. Children that get trafficked like this don't fare so well. So ultimately what happens is the Franklin Committee surrenders the videotapes, and they've got all this evidence that Gary Caradori has collected. And Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman and Robert Spires said that they had investigated and there was nothing to investigate. So here's over 20 hours of videotape of victims talking to Gary Caradori, or giving statements to Gary Caradori and corroborating each other. So the state and the feds impanel grand juries. And this is Samuel Van Pelt. He is going to be the special prosecutor of the state grand jury. And Samuel Van Pelt said, the integrity of the system is being challenged. I feel the system needs to work. The grand jury system is the one process that can work now. Samuel Van Pelt vows that there's going to be justice here, that he's going to get to the bottom of all these lurid allegations. And as these grand juries form, Larry King is whisked out of Omaha, Nebraska. A judge preemptively finds him incompetent to stand trial. It's kind of interesting. He was picked up by the Secret Service and taken to a psychiatric facility, a federal psychiatric facility in Springfield, Missouri. And what's really interesting about this is his good friend, George Herbert Walker Bush, was coming to town that day. And it's been surmised that King was going to ask George for a favor to help him get out of this, because at this point, although he was never charged with one single count of child abuse, he was charged with various financial crimes. King's pastor and boss say King seemed mentally stable, so they're perplexed by King's sudden psychiatric woes, that he has to be quickly transported to a federal psychiatric institution in Springfield, Missouri. And then at this point, the FBI is starting to put heat on Gary Caradori. They are telling the victims, Alicia Owen for sure on this, that if they say that Gary Caradori scripted the child abuse allegations from them, that they will walk from any problems that they could have had. And Caradori realized that the hunter had become the hunted, and he wrote a letter to attorney Jerry Spence, who was a very famous criminal attorney in the 80s and 90s. And this is an excerpt from the letter. I and my staff have been followed. Our telephones, both business and personal, are being monitored. And recently, all of the lug nuts on a vehicle that I've been driving were loosened. In short, what we have discovered is only a small part of a nationwide child exploitation network. It is obvious that the people behind this organization are powerful and ruthless, and are going to great lengths to keep this matter contained. So Gary Caradori suddenly realizes that although he's got these victims that have come forward and corroborated each other, although he's put together all this evidence, that he's going to need blackmail pictures, because that enterprise that was run by King and also Craig Spence, who was in Washington, D.C., it was a blackmail enterprise. It was very similar to Jeffrey Epstein's network. And Gary Caradori made contact with one of the blackmail photographers. His name is Rusty Nelson. And under the auspices of flying to the All-Star game, Gary was a pilot and he had a Cessna. He and his kid flew to Chicago to see the All-Star game. But what Gary was doing was getting blackmail pictures from Rusty Nelson. And Rusty isn't the paragon of ethics. Taking blackmail pictures of adults and children in compromising positions shows that there's a lack of a moral barometer. But I've got him corroborated. Rusty Nelson said that he gave Caradori pictures. Caradori clandestinely conveyed to his wife that he was that he'd gotten the evidence that he needed. He also conveyed that to Donna Owen and to Lauren Schmidt. He did these things clandestinely, but I believe that these phones were tapped. And he also told Paul Rodriguez, a reporter in Washington, D.C., who was also looking at this network on the Washington, D.C. side. So there's 5 people that corroborate that Gary Caradori got these pictures. Now, if Caradori had returned to Nebraska with these pictures, he would have broken this network wide open. And if the dominoes started to fall in Nebraska, they would have fallen all the way to Washington, D.C. But Gary Caradori dies and his son dies flying back to Nebraska. His plane just broke up in the middle of the air on a fairly, the night was fairly serene. And it was said that pilot error caused his plane to disintegrate and break up in the middle of the air. Gary Caradori, throughout his investigation, he had a leather briefcase that he kept at his side. It was almost ubiquitous with him. And that's where he would have put the pictures, according to people that worked with him who I've interviewed. And the briefcase was gone when the authorities arrived. And then shortly thereafter, the grand jury releases a 43-page report on all the child abuse allegations. And they called the child abuse allegations a carefully crafted hoax. Now, here's what's kind of funny about this. I mean, there's a lot of things that are funny. I deconstruct it in the Franklin scandal, but Samuel Van Pelt's grand jury doesn't say who crafted the hoax. It's a very strange document. It kind of implies that Alicia Owen and a number of very drug-addled kids put this carefully crafted hoax together. It did not take into account all of the evidence. And actually, I have the transcripts of that grand jury, and it was very corrupt. A lot of Americans don't understand the grand jury process. And in the grand jury process, a special prosecutor is chosen to oversee a grand jury. And grand jurors are just regular citizens who have shown up for jury duty that are funneled into a grand jury. And the special prosecutor has a tremendous amount of power over how the grand jurors think, because he picks all the evidence that is shown to them and he calls all the witnesses that they're going to hear. And grand juries are notorious for being corrupted. There was a New York judge that said special prosecutors have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. So a carefully crafted hoax is basically a ham sandwich, but the ramifications are stunning. So instead of indicting any of the perpetrators, the grand jury indicts 2 of the victims who wouldn't recant their accounts of abuse. Alicia Owen is indicted on 8 counts of perjury regarding her statements about being molested by Omaha Police Department Chief Robert Wadman and Judge Theodore Carlson, and witnessing then Omaha World Herald publisher Harold Anderson molesting a child. Paul Benassi is indicted on 3 counts of perjury regarding his statements about being molested by Harold Anderson, the publisher of the Omaha World Herald, and witnessing Alicia Owen being molested by Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman. Each count of perjury carries a maximum of 20 years in prison. So Benassi was looking at 60 years in prison, and Alicia was looking at 160 years in prison because she refused to recant accounts of her abuse. She had been trafficked as an adolescent, and she said, I was trafficked as an adolescent, and I'm not going to recant. I'm not going to recant my accounts of abuse. I'm going to stick with the truth. So it's amazing how the media supports the government, and we've seen that with Epstein. And the Epstein charade, it's been very interesting to watch how the media has supported the government. The media has been into digging up salacious dirt, but no one in the mainstream media has called for any kind of justice. There are all these perpetrators that Jeffrey Epstein was providing children to, and thus far, the government hasn't indicted any of them. And I don't think that the government will indict any of them unless there's a groundswell of support for the Epstein victims. But the Omaha World Herald attacks the Franklin Committee. And remember, the publisher of the Omaha World Herald is one of the pedophiles that has been named. The New York Times trumpets the carefully crafted hoax. The Washington Post trumpets the federal grand jury, which also indicted Alicia Owen on 8 counts of perjury. So Alicia is looking at 200 years in prison now. GQ perpetrates a hatchet job on the Franklin Committee and the victims. And CBS perpetrates a hatchet job on the Franklin Committee and the victims. So now we've got not only the Omaha World Herald doing hatchet jobs on the victims, but we also have the national media. as Alicia is waiting to be arraigned, her brother mysteriously commits suicide in a cell in the Lincoln Correction Center. And her brother was 17 years old. And I do not believe that he committed suicide. If you read my book, I really show about a number of anomalies about his death. And these kids, they've all been told, if you don't shut up, your family's going to pay for it. So Alicia Owen's brother found dead. The state versus Alicia Owen, they decided, Douglas County Judiciary, which is Omaha's in Douglas County, decided to go after Alicia Owen first instead of Paul Benassi. And it was the longest criminal trial in Nebraska history. And Alicia's guilt is necessary to sanctify both the state and federal grand juries that declared there was no Larry King related child abuse. This is very important. Alicia has to be found guilty, or else those grand juries are going to be brought into question. And both grand juries said that there was no child abuse. And the examples in Alicia's trial of malfeasance are too numerous to mention. I mentioned a lot of them in the Franklin scandal, but this was a very, very malignant form of jurisprudence that Alicia Owen was up to. So CBS skewers Alicia Owen. On the first full day that the jurors start deliberating Alicia's fate, CBS's 48 Hours broadcast an episode entitled Accusing Prominent People of Sex Crimes. One segment has Troy Bonner, who was one of the victims who the FBI forced to recant his accounts of abuse. One segment has Troy Bonner, former Omaha Police Chief Robert Wadman, and a prominent Omaha attorney trash Alicia Owen's credibility. And it makes repeated references to the grand juries. The 48 Hours reporter even admits he is cognizant of the fact that the episode is being broadcast while Alicia's trial is occurring. And Alicia was in a holding cell in Omaha, I believe, and there was a woman that was next to her, and she turned to Alicia and she said, "You must have really pissed off some very powerful people." So after Alicia's trial, the juror affidavits start coming in, and this juror affidavit is talking about malfeasance. It's talking about how everybody, or most of the jurors, if not all the jurors, watched the 48 Hours. And these juror affidavits also talk about evidence that was being planted in the jury room. They also requested that evidence be brought to them so they could ponder it, but unfortunately, evidence was not brought to them. The evidence that they requested that had been introduced in the trial. So we've got multiple juror affidavits discussing the various forms of malfeasance in Alicia's trial. Here's an excerpt from the juror affidavit. The 48 Hours program was the main topic of discussion. Particular attention was centered on Chief Wadman's discussions. It is clear to me that this impacted every juror who watched it. I am providing this information because I believe a terrible injustice has been done to Miss Owen. And then here's another excerpt from the affidavits. Evidence which the jurors knew and believed had been introduced in the trial was denied the jurors' review, and evidence which had never apparently been introduced was mysteriously provided to the jurors. So with all this malfeasance, Alicia Owen is found guilty on 8 counts of perjury, the state on 8 counts of perjury. And there's a big headline from the Omaha World Herald: Alicia Owen convicted on all 8 counts of perjury. Alicia is sentenced between 9 and 15 years in prison. She was 21 years old when she was indicted, and now she's sentenced to between 9 and 15 years in prison. And the authorities really tried to destroy her. She spent nearly 2 years in solitary. But the state convicted Alicia by the skin of its teeth. I believe that the state thought that Alicia would be a slam dunk because there were so many things going against her. But her lawyer put up a big fight, and so did Alicia and her mother. I mean, they really, really dug into this case. And because the jurors were deliberating for 3 days, and if it probably hadn't been for 48 hours, it would have been a hung jury, or Alicia probably just would have walked. So the perjury charges against Paul Benassi are immediately dropped after Alicia's conviction, because if Paul is found innocent, then Alicia, her guilt will be brought into question. And then ultimately those 2 grand juries that said that there was no child trafficking will be brought into question. So Alicia Owen and her appellate attorneys appeal her case on a myriad of injustices by the judge, the prosecutor, and the jurors, but she doesn't have a shot. Suddenly, Troy Bonners submits a lie or die affidavit. Troy was a lover of Alicia. They were both victims together. And Troy was forced by the FBI to recant. And he struggled with this. He was like a Hamlet. He really loved Alicia, but he lied at the grand jury and he lied at her trial. And he really couldn't, he was having problems facing himself at this point. And here's an excerpt from his affidavit. I and my mother and my family are exhausted from living in fear of death or injury as a result of my personal involvement in the Franklin matters, which ended up in my testifying at grand jury hearings, as well as at the Alicia Owen trial. I lied at the grand jury hearings and I lied at the Alicia Owen trial. I lied when I recanted my original statements to Gary Caradori. I lied because I truly believed and still do believe that it was a situation where I must either lie or die, and at the insistence primarily of the Federal Bureau of Investigation officials. So that's his affidavit, or an excerpt from his affidavit. So Alicia receives an appellate hearing because of Troy's affidavit saying that he was pressured to lie by the FBI agents. And as Alicia and her parents and Troy and Owen's appellate attorney walked through the Douglas County Courthouse towards the courtroom where the hearing was held, Troy Bonner is snatched and rustled to a vacant room. Troy is snatched in the Douglas County Courthouse and dragged to a vacant room. We don't know who exactly snatched him, but the smart money is probably on the Nebraska State Patrol. But waiting for him is Robert Ziegler, who is prosecuting Alicia's case. And a terrified Troy eventually emerged from the room, and he point blank told Owen's appellate attorney that he would invoke the Fifth Amendment when he was called to testify at Owen's hearing, because he did not want to go to prison like Alicia. So there were a number of people that helped put Alicia in prison and cover this up. U.S. Magistrate Richard Koft deposited Lawrence King in a federal psychiatric unit, is now a U.S. District Court judge. Thomas Tolkien, the assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Nebraska, who prosecuted the federal grand jury that found that there wasn't any child abuse allegations, is now a U.S. magistrate. Gerald Moran, who was the Douglas County deputy attorney who prosecuted Alicia's trial, is now a Douglas County district judge. And Robert Ziegler, who awaited a terrified Troy Bonner in that vacant room and was responsible for quashing all of Alicia's appeals, he is now an assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Nebraska. So if you partook of covering up this pedophile network, you definitely became upwardly mobile if you were part of the judiciary. This has a big time DC connection, the Franklin scandal. I get into it in the book. Craig Spence was very much like a Jeffrey Epstein character. He was a lobbyist, he was a power broker, and he had a house that was wired for audio-visual blackmail. And he was also a CIA asset. And in the Franklin scandal, I have 5 sources that corroborate Larry King and Craig Spence were in the business of pedophilic pandering and blackmail. Spence had the juice to arrange midnight tours of the White House for male prostitutes. Mind-boggling, but he had that kind of power. And the Washington Times reported on power brokers served drugs, sex at parties bugged for blackmail. And in the book that I co-authored, Confessions of a DC Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail, Henry Vincent, who ran the escort service, was dealing with Craig Spence, and we get into all the machinations of Spence's blackmail operation in that book. I talk about it in the Franklin scandal, but I get into it in much more detail in Confessions of a DC Madam. So Larry King, he went to jail for 10 years for his financial crimes. And that was it. He wasn't charged with a single count of child abuse. And then he had basically a no-show job at the BMW of Sterling, Virginia. And here is a press release of Granville Academy Now, I never quite figured out what Granville Academy was. Granville Academy isn't an academy. It's not a school. It takes lower socioeconomic children on field trips. And guess what? We have one of the people that is taking part in that is Lawrence King, executive assistant to the principals at BMW of Sterling. So Larry inveigled himself into Granville Academy, where he would have access to lower socioeconomic children, much like he did in Omaha, Nebraska. But I found out about it and I conscripted a number of people and we inundated Granville Academy with phone calls. And as you can see right here, Larry's name is deleted from the press release. And right here it says, thanks for the comments. Larry King has been removed from the itinerary. King ultimately inveigled himself to Opera Nova. One of the things that it does is it gives opera lessons to children that are striving to be singers. And lo and behold, there's Larry. He's part of Opera Nova. Doesn't he look happy? He's even on the board of directors of Opera Nova. He's looking quite distinguished. Well, the same thing that happened with Granville Academy happened with Opera Nova. I inundated Opera Nova with phone calls and I conscripted others to inundate Opera Nova with phone calls. And this is on their website, or was on their website. Larry King is no longer associated with Opera Nova. King also tried to infiltrate the Washington Redskins event committee, and I got him kicked out of that too. But here is a guy, he's a predator. He's a super predator. And despite his history, he's looking for all kinds of ways where he can prey on children. That's his thing. Now, all the children that he's preyed on since he's been out of prison, that's on the federal government. The federal government knows what Larry King is all about. And they know that he's a child molester. And obviously they didn't even tell him, stay away from children, because he's infiltrated 3 groups, which would potentially give him access to children. And I've got him kicked out of all 3 groups, but you would think that he would try once or twice, but he's 3 times. So this fits in the pattern of a predator like Lawrence E. King. He's not going to stop. Guys like him don't stop molesting children. And our federal government bears the onus for allowing Lawrence E. King out of prison to molest children. Now, Franklin and Epstein, the networks share a number of similarities. The networks colluded in the interstate trafficking of children to the rich and powerful. There were hidden cameras in 3 of Epstein's homes. There were hidden cameras in his home in Florida. There were hidden cameras in his home in New York, and there were hidden cameras on his island. And stories have come out that have said that he was involved in blackmail, and he was busted for child abuse in southern Florida. And ultimately, the feds let him walk because Alexander Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney, was told to back away from Epstein because Epstein was quote unquote intelligence. So that's what enabled him to walk. Now, there's only 2 people in the government that can tell, constitutionally, that can tell a U.S. attorney to back down. And that is the president and also the attorney general. So hidden cameras, blackmail, and intelligence were reportedly integral to both networks. The networks produced shocking aberrations in the legal system to protect perpetrators and discredit victims. The networks seemingly came to an end after the suicide of their ringmasters. But here's the thing. Jeffrey Epstein was providing children to predators, and predators aren't going to stop. As I sit here talking, I'm sure that there are predators within the Jeffrey Epstein network that are molesting children or thinking about molesting children. Although we can't really do anything about the Franklin network because of the statute of limitations. The Epstein network, the statute of limitations are working in our favor. And actually the federal government can indict the perpetrators in the Epstein network. Another thing that these 2 networks have in common is Attorney General William Barr. William Barr was Bush 1's attorney general, and he helped cover up the Franklin network. He took over from Richard Thornburg. Richard Thornburg started the cover-up, but William Barr finished the cover-up of the Franklin Network, and he was Trump's attorney general when he covered up the Epstein network. So Bill Barr, if you plug his name into the internet and Google it, you'll discover that he's been involved in all types of sordid things. And that is the end of my Franklin presentation. I hope you found it edifying. And we really have to make sure that these Epstein perpetrators are found guilty of molesting children. We can't let them walk. I've been dealing with these type of networks for a long time, and we know who the perpetrators are on the Epstein network, and they have to be brought to justice.